Order. We now come to a debate entitled, a petition debate entitled relating to the right to protest. Before we begin, it might be helpful to remind the House that any live legal cases connected with recent protests will engage the House's sub judice resolution and should not be raised in debate. You're advised to exercise restraint and to try to avoid making remarks that might prejudice the legal processes in any way. And with that, I call Matt Vickers to propose a motion.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 579012 relating to the rights to protest. I'd like to thank the petition creator, Samantha Hurst, and all those who signed the petition for creating this opportunity for us to debate what I'm sure we will all consider to be a very important issue. As of the 19th of April, the petition itself has received over 248,000 signatures from right across the UK. And so this is something that has attracted a lot of attention. Rightly, there is a lot of concern about anything that could be perceived as interfering with the right to protest. The petition begins by stating the right to peaceful assembly and protest are fundamental principles of any democracy. And I think this is something all members will wholeheartedly agree and believe in. Our history and way of life have been shaped by protests and the right of people across this country to express their opinions. This freedom is something that must be protected at all costs. In my view, the right to peaceful protest cannot, however, come at the expense of the rights of others. The rights of thousands of people to get to work, for an ambulance to get to a hospital, for a newspaper to be printed, or a public transport network to operate. It's regrettable that during this incredibly challenging year, we've seen some protesters adopt disruptive tactics, creating a huge impact on the lives of thousands of people trying to go about their daily lives. They've placed huge additional pressures on our incredible emergency service workers and created a huge drain on public funds. During the Extinction Rebellion protests in April and October 2019, areas of London were brought to a standstill, and the cost of policing these protests was a staggering £37 million. Imagine how that police time could be put to better use, or what we could do in our constituencies with that money. In fact, imagine how that money could have been used to tackle climate change or helping to decarbonise our economy. Over the summer of 2020, 172 Metropolitan Police officers were assaulted by a violent minority during the Black Lives Matter protests. This was not a peaceful protest, and that is why the government needs to give our frontline police officers the power they need to ensure that it's not allowed to happen again. Strengthening the powers of the police to safely manage legitimate protests not only benefits wider society, but specifically those who wish to undertake meaningful and peaceful protest. When your son, daughter, husband or wife tells you they're off to a protest, you should not be filled with dread that they could be hurt or subjected to abuse, or that they might get mixed up in something. For the interests of legitimate protesters, we must look at what is needed to prevent some of the violent and abusive behaviour we've seen at protests during the last year. There are serial protesters out there who choose to go along to legitimate demonstrations, sometimes even fuelled by drink or drugs. They go along to disrupt and abuse others. They undermine our meaningful protests and can tarnish the causes and reputations of others who wish to promote such causes. It's right that the government give the police powers to ensure protests are not hijacked by small minorities who adopt abusive, violent and disruptive tactics. I understand that concerns around the bill are in some ways based possibly on misconceptions and misinformation around a few specific points, and I'm sure the Minister will add clarity on these. There are loony lefty, walkie-talkie social media accounts out there that would have you believe the government were removing any meaningful right to protest. I'm sure those who took the time to look at the detail would be aware that's not the case. The right to protest remains rightfully protected, and the vast majority of protests and protesters will be entirely unaffected by these measures. There are suggestions that the measures ban the protests that are annoying. It's not the case. The bill does not introduce a power to ban protests, and annoyance is not a concept plucked from thin air. The public nuisance offence looks to capture behaviour that causes the public, or a section of the public, to suffer serious annoyance. This is consistent with the existing common law offence of public nuisance and does not connote merely feeling annoyed. There have also been suggestions that the measures will ban protests outside Parliament, and I hope that the Minister will confirm that that will not be the case. The many causes and characters should rightly continue to be represented here at the heart of our democratic system. But the powers should mean and will mean that the police officers have the power to prevent elected representatives and those with business being prevented from entering the estate. And rightly so. To prevent access to Parliament is to deny rightful democratic process. So yes, I think the provisions within the bill are necessary, but we should continue to have robust debates like the one I'm sure we're about to see, and discussions about the right to protest. The government must protect protesters from abusive and violent thugs who seek to hijack their causes. And similarly, it must protect the rights of citizens to go about their daily lives unaffected by the protests of others. Thank you.
Order. The question is that this House considered e-petition 579012 relating to the right to protest. And we now go virtually to Bristol East. Kay McCarthy.
Thank you, Sir James. I think it's rather disappointing that the member
the Honourable
has
Lady
just spoken.
the Honourable Lady may know something I don't, but I regret to say it's just Mr Gray. One day, perhaps. One day, you never know.
It is extremely long overdue. I find it very hard to believe. But sorry then, Mr Gray. It's disappointing, as I was saying, that the member who has just spoken has chosen to frame the debate in the way that he has, with talk of loony lefties and other pejoratives. I don't think that is at all helpful, and I hope that today we can try and have a measured debate about what is a very sensitive, controversial topic. I thought it important as a Bristol MP to speak in this debate, given that of the top 4 constituencies in terms of the number of signatures to this petition, 3 are Bristol seats. There were 3,615 signatories from Bristol West, which comes as no surprise. It usually tops the charts on these occasions. There was 1,455 from Bristol South and 1,343 from my own constituency of Bristol East. Bristol North West was a little further down the list with 972 signatories. I also had lots of emails from constituents about the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill around the time of its second reading. Some were touching on other elements of the bill, for example, the provisions that would affect gypsies and travellers and perhaps would have an impact on ramblers, for example. Others calling for stronger protections in the bill, which are notable by their absence on protecting women and girls against violence. But the majority of the emails I had were from people who were alarmed and angry about the public order provisions in Part 3 of the bill that have given rise to the petition that we're debating here today. Bristol has a proud radical tradition. In 1788, we were the first city outside London to set up a committee for the abolition of the slave trade. The first petition that campaign set up got some 800 signatures, which actually, if you think back then in the days before social media, that was no mean feat. And I think it more than rivals the number of signatures that this petition has managed to get in this day and age. It's also noteworthy that that campaign was one of the first political campaigns in which women were allowed to be involved. More recently, in the 1960s, the Bristol bus boycott led to the first UK racial equalities legislation, spearheaded by one of my predecessors in this seat, Tony Benn. And last summer, we saw the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston, the slave trader, during Black Lives Matter's protests in the city. And all of those protests were significant moments, historically and in a local sense. There have been many more protests in the city of less significance that haven't sparked international debate, that haven't led to change, or at least not yet. In some cases, like the school climate strikes, the significance is in being a tiny part of a greater global movement. And I think that for young people in particular, actually feeling that, just maybe you can make a difference, just by making banners, painting your faces, taking to the streets, making your voices heard, that is hugely important for young people. It's too easy to look at what appears to be vast global indifference to the fate of the planet and despair. So I applaud all those that haven't given up hope. And of course, it's easy to celebrate the school climate strikers, and the chances are that this legislation would not be used against them. But that is why I think clauses 54 to 60 in this bill are so dangerous, because a subjective element starts to creep in terms of what is deemed to be acceptable, and in the words of the honourable member that introduced this debate, legitimate protests, and what is deemed to be not acceptable and not legitimate. As I read through those clauses in the bill, I could see the appeal actually, in myself, I could see the appeal in invoking some of the provisions against, for example, the far-right thugs who occasionally attempt to march in pitiful numbers, it has to be said, in Bristol. But there will be others who see exactly the same opportunities when it comes to Black Lives Matter protesters. The problem with this bill is that it gives the police and the courts powers to decide what is acceptable, what is troublesome, what is annoying, what is too noisy. The police have a difficult enough time as it is when it comes to policing protests. And this bill means there is huge potential for political interference and for pressure on the police to intervene. As was said during the second reading debate, the definition of nuisance could apply to almost any protests we see outside Parliament. I do want to say just a little about the recent protests we've seen in Bristol. I've made clear my condemnation of the violence, particularly on March 21st, and my concern about some policing tactics on March 26th. I don't want to revisit that here, other than to say that since then, I've spent the best part of a day with the police at Silver Command during one of the more recent protests, observing the decisions that were made on crowd control, etc., and particularly how they managed there'd been a very peaceful, positive protest during the late afternoon, but there was a group of people that stayed on very late and at one point tried to block the motorway by having a sit down, and they were having a bit of a rave as well. And in general, I think the police have got it right when it comes to policing these protests, but I appreciate that theirs is not an easy job. And what I do want to say to the protesters, and I will preface it by saying that I absolutely want people in Bristol to take part in peaceful protests. People have a right to be heard. They have a right to get out on the streets and express their views. But as I've said, when I've met with representatives of various groups who oppose this bill, and as the Mayor of Bristol has told them too, think about what you're trying to achieve. Think about who you need to win over. Think about how you can best do that. If you're protesting against this bill, educate yourself about the parliamentary process and when the crucial votes will come. If you're campaigning for the right to assemble and protest and trying to stop the introduction of laws that are predicated upon the, in my view, false assertion that we have a problem in this country with uncontained, out-of-hand, destructive political demonstrations, then it's entirely counterproductive to take part in a protest that culminates in people throwing eggs, fireworks and other missiles at the police, in torching police vehicles and attempting to trash a police station. It's not acceptable for very many reasons. It's not acceptable in itself, but it's tactically stupid too, and it plays entirely into the hands of the Home Secretary and others who are attempting to stir up division and to exploit fear and prejudice. And dare I say it, if you live somewhere with a Tory MP, within travelling distance of Bristol, it might be an idea to focus your political activity, your peaceful protests there, instead of coming to Bristol to join in what is a much larger protest here, which is when you have a Bristol Labour Mayor and Bristol Labour MPs who are all committed to opposing this bill. It's also worth saying that even policing a peaceful process does cost the city a lot of money and diverts resources away from other police activities. Blocking the streets in the city centre not only causes inconvenience to motorists, but my main worry when I went along and observed the operation with Silver Command was the fact that I'd learnt that the buses were all on divert through the city centre. And when you get key workers or people in low paid jobs that are having to walk home alone through city streets late at night because the buses are on divert, they're having to go some distance to get to a bus stop. I really think it comes to a point when you've had your say in a protest and it's time to let people resume their normal lives. So while I entirely respect people's right to protest, I would urge them to exercise that right wisely and well. I believe that with concerted action, by joining together, by making the arguments, by peaceful protest, democratic and peaceful means, we can stop Part 3 of this bill becoming law. So let's all try and work together to do that, and not, as I said, play into the Home Secretary's hands by abusing the rights that we have. Thank you.
Let's go to Brighton. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I would like to join the Honourable Member for Bristol East in disassociating myself from, frankly, what I think were smears from the Honourable Member for Stockton South. There is no misunderstanding about what this bill will do, and I think it's quite condescending to suggest otherwise. The vast, vast majority of protesters are entirely peaceful. They represent a cross-section of our constituents, and they know that there is a proud history of peaceful protest in this country which needs to be defended. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate and add to what I said during the second reading of this bill, namely that this legislation is dangerous, undemocratic, and disproportionate. And it's clear that huge numbers of our constituents feel the same. Nearly 2,500 Brighton Pavilion residents have signed the petition opposing any restrictions on our right to peaceful protest. And I know too from my inbox that there is grave concern about giving the police new powers to undermine what are treasured and critical fundamental rights in any democracy. Handing more draconian powers to the police would be troubling at any time. It is especially dangerous when too much of their response to the outpouring of anger and grief at the murder of Sarah Everard has been characterised by bad judgment, heavy-handedness, and tone deafness. Footage of women apparently being wrestled to the ground by male police officers at vigils to protest male violence and to remember a woman killed by a police officer sent shockwaves around the country. Moreover, this bill has been tabled at a time when, as a recent police watchdog report makes clear, the police have responded to the demands of the pandemic and the frightening lack of clarity from ministers about what was and was not a criminal offence by overreaching and with overzealousness. A review from the CPS suggests that the Coronavirus Act has been misapplied by the police 232 times since last year. In fact, that's every single time it's been used to charge someone. Throughout the pandemic, heavy-handed police interpretation has not only been sanctioned, it's been encouraged by ministers. So let's be absolutely clear. It is a blatant and biased attack on the long-standing right to protest from a government that has a track record of dismissing the rule of law, the truth, legal obligations, and human rights as disposable inconveniences. And as an aside, I would remind colleagues that the government is also seeking to change how judicial review works, further evidence of their ongoing opposition to future accountability and the rule of law. This bill is about protecting those with power, and presumably with the Prime Minister's mobile number on speed dial, and it's protecting them from being challenged or held to account by the citizens of this country. And it does that with a range of restrictions on the right to freely assemble and to express dissent. For example, the bill seeks to extend the practice of handing out harsh sanctions as a disincentive to those considering organising protests, and extending it to anyone simply taking part is insidious. At the same time, ministers want to increase almost fourfold the length of time organisers could potentially be imprisoned. These and other countless proposals are chilling. Put simply, everyone in this country risks being criminalised simply for exercising their democratic rights if this bill becomes law. Friends of the Earth warn of the particular barriers that will be created for those from marginalised communities to have their voices heard, such as the people of colour, who already have disproportionately negative experiences of policing and the criminal justice system. The hostile measures contained in Part 4 of the bill, and which will clearly be used to target the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community, appear nothing short of racist in their intention. This bill is about silencing our constituents and communities, metaphorically and indeed quite literally, with the clauses that would allow a protest to be severely restricted by the police in anticipation that it might be too noisy and thereby disrupt those at whom it is aimed. Yet right now, the voices of our constituents and of campaigners clamouring for this bill to be scrapped are being echoed far and wide. The opposition is cross-party and it's growing. Critics of aspects of Section 3 of the bill include two former Home Secretaries, Lord Blunkett and the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead. A former Greater Manchester Police Chief Constable, a former Durham Constabulary Chief Constable, and a former Metropolitan Police Commander have all warned of the dangers this legislation poses to British democracy and to safe policing by consent in our communities. So will the government stop and listen? Now, when I spoke on this bill at second reading stage, I noted that it would have made Greta Thunberg, sitting alone with a placard, a potential criminal. Likewise, all the brave and passionate young people who know the future of humanity and of our planet depends on peaceful protests exposing just how inadequate government action is to the scale of the climate and nature emergencies. And as one of the few MPs to have been arrested during a peaceful protest and subsequently, after a week's court case, acquitted in court of any wrongdoing, I have first-hand experience of the power of non-violent direct action. My protest was against fracking as part of a movement which has secured an effective moratorium on that technology. Protest works, it changes things, and throughout our long history as a country, people have assembled to express their dissent and have changed the course of that history. You know, I remember when members from all sides of the House were falling over themselves to be associated with the suffragettes on the 100th anniversary of the Representation of the People Act. You know, back then, protest was suddenly not a dirty word. Now, when the protests are a little closer to home, whether that's Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion, it seems the right to protest is no longer quite so universally celebrated. But fundamental rights aren't like multiple choice. You don't get to pick the most convenient and carelessly ditch the rest. They are universal and they should be defended in their entirety. So I'd like to end my intervention this evening by calling on the Minister to tell us the truth, to answer this question honestly. Is the government committed to upholding the human rights and civil liberties set out in Articles 10 and 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights? The policing minister recently affirmed, and I quote, "The right to peaceful protest is a fundamental tool of civic expression." He went on to promise that protest will, and I quote, "never be curtailed by this government." And yet the police, crime, sentencing and courts bill before us seeks to do exactly that. He and his government either need to level with the British public about the facts, or they need to put this dangerous, undemocratic and disproportionate bill where it belongs, on the scrap heap.
Now I go to my constituent neighbour in Bath, Weir Hophouse.
Thank you, Mr. Gray, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I want to congratulate those who started the petition. Clearly, there are people out there who really care about our democracy. It is debatable whether members of the government care about democracy in the same way as the people out there. And it is quite unbelievable that we need to be here today debating the right to protest. I too disassociate myself from the comments made by the member from Stockton South who introduced the debate tonight. And I do believe it was rather unfortunate that this important debate has been introduced in that way. The government draconian policing, crime, sentencing and courts bill is a timely reminder that we must never take our democratic rights for granted. The section of the bill amending the Public Order Act is an assault on our civil liberties, and it must go. This petition has been signed by 250,000 people, including over 1,000 of my constituents in Bath. As they know, and so clearly say, protest is a fundamental part of any functioning democracy. It is a way for every one of us to stand up to what we believe in, to have our voices heard, and to speak truth to power. The government says that this bill is about protecting communities from the most destructive protests. Let us not be deceived. This bill aims to quite literally silence protests and criminalize those who take part and organize demonstrations. Over 700 legal scholars have warned about the bill's anti-protest measures. There is no evidence to show that demonstration tactics have become more disruptive or more extreme. In fact, according to legal academics, mass arrests at protests very frequently lead to low conviction rates. And indeed, we have just heard from the Honourable Lady from Brighton about her experience of having been arrested and then it was found that she did nothing wrong. Yes, peaceful protest can be noisy. It can be inconvenient. It can even cause disruption. And not everybody agrees with everybody on which issues to pick when protesting. But it should not be for the power of government or for the police to decide what people should be allowed to protest on. The whole idea of protest and the whole protection that we have in law is that it is for the people to pick on the issues that they have their voices heard. It is no reason, therefore, to stifle protest. The whole purpose of a demonstration is to have one's voice heard and to get the attention of those who make decisions. Time and time again, it has been a driver for positive change. Because of the right to protest, we now have a moratorium on fracking. Because of the right to protest, the UK's anti-apartheid movement kept apartheid on the British political agenda. And let's not forget, because of the right to protest, women achieved the right to vote. The government should not be seeking to shut down the legitimate way of holding the powerful to account. This measure that is in front of us is a thinly veiled reaction to the climate protests that we have seen over the past few years, not just around Parliament, but in towns and cities across the country. The climate emergency has evoked strong feelings, especially amongst young people. Curtailing their voices would be absolutely the wrong thing to do, as it is especially the next generation who will bear the brunt of a climate catastrophe if this government fails to act now. Every generation has to fight again for its freedoms. Each generation faces different challenges, but it is the diversity of voices from all sections of our society that makes our democracy stronger. These voices should never be silenced or suppressed. The right to protest is fundamental to our democracy. To limit or curtail it is simply undemocratic, and this government should be ashamed for even proposing it. The proposals in the bill currently before Parliament must go. Thank you, Mr. Gray.
To Liverpool now, Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Gray, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I'm pleased to be able to contribute to this very important debate today. And like other members, I've received a high number of emails about the bill, and also would like to disassociate myself from the derogatory comments made by the member for Stockton South. Liverpool has a long history of peaceful protests and campaigns for social justice. And the police crime sentencing and court bill is just one of a number of recent profoundly concerning moves in this government's calculated and authoritarian agenda to sweep aside democracy, stifle dissent and strengthen the hand of the state against the people. And the recent Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill provides immunity to state agents breaking the law in our country. And last week we debated the Overseas Operations Bill, which now in its final stages will create an unprecedented two-tier legal system of human rights. We will soon be facing a voter suppression bill, which will restrict the right to vote from Black, working class and other disadvantaged communities, as well as plans to limit the judicial review process to stop the public challenging the government's decisions in court. The Police Crime and Sentencing and Court Bill gives unprecedented powers to police and the Home Secretary to criminalise people standing up for social justice. And this includes draconian punishment of up to 10 years in prison for anyone who poses the risk of serious annoyance or who causes a public nuisance. And these provisions strike at the heart of our democracy and the trade union movement and severely erode the public's right to protest and hold the government accountable for its actions. Working people throughout history have campaigned with protest and demonstrations for democratic rights in the face of exploitation and oppression by employers and governments. And in the last year, we've seen widespread and popular demonstrations around Black Lives Matter, violence against women, environmental concerns and more. And if this bill passes through into law, all these actions will be under threat. The petition has received nearly 250,000 signatures and over 14,000 responses to their linked online survey, showing the strength of disgust that people have for the contents of this bill. And over 250 civil society organisations have signed a letter warning that the bill represents an attack on some of the most fundamental rights of our citizens. And these signatories span from human rights organisations to environmental campaign groups to homelessness organisations and GRT rights groups to trade unions representing millions of people. The right to protest is the lifeblood of any democracy, and these provisions will not make us safer. Instead, they strengthen the hand of the state against all who oppose or fall foul of it. And most concerningly for Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, as the police will be given powers to break up so-called unauthorised encampments and needlessly push people into the criminal justice system. Chair, last week, campaigners forced a significant U-turn from this government, forcing it to exclude torture, genocide and crimes against humanity from the scope of its overseas operations bill. This victory shows the fight is not yet over, and we must and we will do this again and force this government to drop this crackdown on our rights to collectively organise against injustice. Thank you, Chair.
The Shadow Minister, Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I would like to say at the start that I do think the member for Stockton South made some slightly misguided remarks in terms of what we're debating here today. Perhaps a bit insulting to his constituents that enjoy the right to protest and to mine. And I also am just reflecting on who's speaking in this debate, and I'm looking on my screen at 4 very powerful women who are in Parliament, because back, as the member for Brighton Pavilion says, we had the suffragettes, Dorinda Nelligan, who is was a head teacher in Croydon, who was a great suffragette and got arrested actually several times in Parliament in 2009, 2010. I'm sure if she was watching today, she'd say, well, jolly good thing that we got the vote, jolly good thing that these powerful women are here today making a case for British democracy, which is what we're standing up for today. No more and no less than that. And I hope the member for Stockton South will reflect a bit on his comments. I think all the speeches that we've heard have made powerful cases. The member for Bristol East, of course, has in Bristol, I don't know what's in the waters in Bristol, but there are a lot of protests and a lot of active members of the community, and she made a powerful case for the fact that the police have pretty much got things right during this difficult last year, but that we have to protect the right to protest, and people need to think wisely and well about how they do that and how they win arguments. But the member for Brighton Pavilion, very powerful case in terms of the fundamental rights that we have is not multiple choice, as she says. You can't pick and choose which you like and which you don't. I have not been arrested. I have not actually. I'm not much of a protester, I have to say, but I absolutely fundamentally believe that we must protect the right to protest, and I meet every 6 weeks with a group of largely women in their 50s, 60s and 70s from my constituency who are very active campaigners on climate change. And the last time I met with them, they were absolutely adamant that these changes would be very damaging for them and their rights to make their case, which they want to do powerfully and peacefully for more action on climate change. We talked a bit about the petition, 250,000 people who have signed it, which is a very significant number. The Petitions Committee used an online survey to ask petitioners their views, and 95% of respondents were concerned that proposals to increase police powers would prevent the public being able to hold the government to account. And 3/4 of the respondents were also concerned that these proposals could result in restrictions being imposed on protests, prevent protests from going ahead, and result in people taking part in protests facing criminal charges. And respondents said that peaceful protest was democratic, a human, fundamental and basic right. And they were concerned that increased police powers would limit opportunities for people to express dissent, hold government to account and bring about positive change. Respondents were also concerned that the bill would curtail peaceful, well-managed protests, and in doing so, risked increasing unorganised violent protests as a result. As members have pointed out from across the different political parties this afternoon, that the right to protest is a fundamental freedom, a hard-won democratic tradition that we are deeply proud of. And throughout our history, as we've heard, protests have led to significant change in this country for the better. The proposals that the government have made are risky, unnecessary, and will be damaging to those traditions at the heart of our democracy. Mr. Chairman, the arguments have been well made, but I just want to make 4 very broad points. First, the legislation as drafted is incredibly broad and vague. This has already been mentioned, but the measures in this bill target protesters for causing serious unease and serious annoyance. Such measures would definitely have prevented the great protests of history, and that vague term, serious unease, seems a very low threshold for police-imposed conditions. It's hard to imagine our society as one where the police can impose directions on a protest for simply being noisy. But there is, but that is what this bill would do. There's also a penalty in the bill for someone who breaches a police-imposed condition on a protest when they ought to have known that the condition existed. But if you're attending a protest and the police have placed conditions on the number of people allowed to attend, how will attendees know if they're the 101 person to join and therefore breaching the conditions? This clause could effectively criminalise people who don't realise that they're breaching conditions. Currently, protests must involve at least 2 people to engage police powers, but the new measures would allow the police to issue conditions on a 1-person protest. So if 1 person protesting is causing another person in the vicinity to suffer serious unease, alarm or distress, or the noise generated by the person carrying on the protest may have a relevant impact on persons in the vicinity of the protest, the police are able to impose conditions. Now, the breadth of those powers is clearly too wide. Steve Bray's shouts of "Stop Brexit" were incredibly irritating for all of us, I suspect, but that doesn't mean that he shouldn't have been able to make his point and that he was causing any damage or harm by doing what he was doing. The point of protests, as has been said, is to capture people's and the government's attention. Sometimes protests, well, pretty much always are noisy, that is the point of them, and sometimes they are annoying, but they are as fundamental to our democracy as Parliament is and as the courts are. And the former Prime Minister, at the second reading debate for this bill, made that point. She said these proposals are concerning and risk going against the right to freedom of speech. And Sir Peter Fahy, who's a respected former constable of Greater Manchester Police, said people need to be really worried about this. The right to protest, the right to gather, the right to have a voice is fundamental to our democracy, and particularly British democracy. Bringing in legislation on the back of Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion demonstrations, rushing that legislation through, putting in some really dodgy definitions, which the police are supposed to make sense of. If we've learned one thing from the coronavirus legislation, it's that rushed legislation and unclear definitions cause huge confusion for the public and for the police having to enforce it. And that brings me to my second point. This legislation would put the police in a really difficult situation, having to make judgment calls every time and no doubt getting the blame because those judgments would be seen as political choices. Now, I support the police. As Shadow Policing Minister, I think they've done a really good job through COVID times with very difficult circumstances, with legislation brought in very last minute. They had to try and understand and try and police very draconian legislation that they'd never had to do before. And it cannot be right that our police are attacked or assaulted. And we have seen attacks on our police and other emergency services increase over recent years, and more needs to be done about that. And you know, at the weekend, we saw police officers in the Met injured as they dispersed crowds during an anti-lockdown protest. And violent protest is never right. But these new powers are so vague that they will force the police to make political decisions about which completely non-violent protests they are under pressure to deem to be unlawful. This is extremely concerning and will put the police and the public in a difficult position. Why do the government want to make the police the gatekeepers for public protest? The public order measures in this bill risk putting the police in a difficult position more often and creating more disorder and disruption. And the government shouldn't be putting the police in that position where the rules are too confusing, too broad, they will only create more flashpoints. It's also worth pointing out that the government has decided to bring forward this contentious legislation restricting the right to protest in the middle of a pandemic, when we have very difficult laws that the police are trying to implement. And you have to ask, why make this decision that potentially puts public health at risk by forcing the public to protest against their freedom, to protest being taken away from them in the middle of a pandemic? My third point, one that has been well rehearsed again, is that these changes give dangerous powers to the Home Secretary. The Home Secretary can make regulations about the meaning of serious disruption. And the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, again made a really important point in her speech in the second reading debate. She said, it is tempting when Home Secretary to think that giving powers to the Home Secretary is very reasonable because we all think we're reasonable, but future Home Secretaries may not be so reasonable. The idea of giving the Home Secretary such a big power to impose their own perspective on what lawfully constitutes as annoying or too noisy is deeply alarming. So if there's a peaceful protest outside the Home Office that the Home Secretary doesn't like, are they going to criminalise everyone for shouting too loud? I would like to ask the Minister if he has a cause that he cares deeply about. If he wanted to go and protest about it, does he want really the Home Secretary to ultimately have the say in whether what he's saying is right or wrong, or whether it's too loud or not? I know that I wouldn't. And finally, Mr. Gray, and this is really important, that the existing legislation is sufficient to cover the issues that have been raised as concerns. You know, the Public Order Act of 1986 and other powers appear on the statute book to police protests. And I'm not sure why we think that legislation isn't enough. Now, I think there are probably questions about when they've been implemented and how that legislation is implemented, but the laws are there, they are really clear, and they are plenty strong enough to stop the kind of disruptive protests and violent protests and the kind of protests that we would need and the police would need to be able to stop. The police have the powers to break up protests that cause harm or serious public disorder, serious damage to property, or serious disruption to the life of the community. Finally, Mr. Gray, as a member for Brighton Fillion mentioned, Michael Barton, who's the former Chief Constable of Durham Police, compared the measures in this bill to that of a paramilitary-style police force and asked if the government is happy to be linked to the repressive regimes currently flexing their muscles via their police forces. Now, that seems like strong words, but there is a delicate balance between the need for police to keep order and to ensure that protests are peaceful and the legitimate right to protest on the causes that we all care about. The police officers I speak to do not want to undermine that balance. They want our respect, they want fair pay, they don't want to be assaulted, they want to get on with their jobs, they want to fight crime, but they understand those Pelian principles. The right to express our thoughts collectively through protest is one of the cornerstones of our British traditions. It would be of great concern if this government passed laws to protect them from any public proclamation of criticism. The police are the people and the people are the police. The cooperation of the public diminishes proportionately to the necessity of the use of force. So I would say to the Minister, can he tell us what serious unease or annoyance is? Can he tell us what too much noise sounds like? Which protests would he have stopped under this new legislation? And can he tell us why they are bringing this rushed, undefined, broad measures in that will inevitably undermine the right to protest? And finally, will he reflect on the words of the former Prime Minister, on the words of senior police officers, and the words of 250,000 petitioners who are asking him to think again? Thank you.
Police Minister Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Gray, soon to be Sir, a great pleasure to appear under your wise and beneficent guidance this afternoon for what I think it's fair to say has been a binary debate with not much nuance between the sides. My congratulations to the member for Stockton South, the first son of Stockton South, for his speech this afternoon and for leading this debate on the petition. My thanks to other members for contributing, not least the member for Bristol East, who unwittingly made a strong case for the legislation, and also to the member for Brighton Pavilion, who gave us the hilarious prospect of criticising the member for Stockton South for his remarks, and then indulged in such hyperbole and invective that she neatly illustrated why, unlike in Germany, the Greens will always be a fringe party in this country. Now, Mr Gray, obviously those who signed this petition are concerned about the impact of the new measures in the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Bill that they may have on peaceful protest. And I do want to start by reaffirming the government's firm commitment to the right to peaceful protest. It is, as the member for Brighton Pavilion pointed out, a fundamental tool of civic expression. I also wish to reaffirm our commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights, namely Articles 10 and 11, which set out everyone's right to freedom of expression, assembly and association, and they are my rights as well as yours. However, the very same human rights legislation makes it clear that these rights are not absolute and must be balanced with the rights and freedoms of others. Now, the member for Croydon Central, my opposition spokesperson, said that we put the police in a difficult position, and yet it was the police who asked for a number of these measures. The Metropolitan Police Service and the National Police Youth Council have expressed concerns that existing public order legislation, which has not been updated for 35 years, is no longer appropriate for responding to the highly disruptive protest tactics we've seen today. In fact, in order to understand how effectively the police do manage protests and how legislation could be updated to improve police effectiveness without eroding the right to protest, the government commissioned Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary to conduct an inspection into the policing of protest. The report found that too often, and I quote directly from the inspector, the balance may tip too readily in favour of protesters when, as is often the case, the police do not accurately assess the level of disruption caused or likely to be caused by a protest. These and other observations lead us to conclude that a modest reset of the scales is needed. End quotation. The disruption caused by these protests is made clearer when we examine the cost to the taxpayer. As the Honourable Gentleman pointed out, during the Extinction Rebellion protests of April and October 2019, some of London's busiest areas were brought to a standstill for several days. This had a disproportionate impact on commuters, small businesses and ambulance services, with the policing operation for the two extended protests costing £37 million, more than twice the annual budget of London's Violent Crime Task Force. In another example, on the 4th of September 2020, protesters blocked the entrances and exits from the printing presses. News UK estimates that it lost over £1 million and it was unable to send out 60 to 70% of its print run that day. These highly disruptive protests require police officers from around the country to step away from their regular responsibilities to instead police a protest. During Extinction Rebellion's two-week autumn uprising, so-called, in addition to the thousands of Metropolitan Police officers, nearly 1,100 officers were drawn from across England, Scotland and Wales. Instead, they could have been protecting the communities they're supposed to be serving. What is more, on top of this drain on resources, police officers are often threatened, verbally abused, assaulted and injured when policing protests. In London, a total of 23 Met police officers were seriously injured in the line of duty during a single weekend of protest in June last year. And in the recent disgraceful Kill the Bill protests in Bristol, Avon and Somerset police are investigating assaults on 40 officers and one member of the media. This behaviour from extreme elements of the Kill the Bill protests, as well as equally violent elements of other groups, is totally unacceptable and should be condemned by all right-thinking people. Given the results of the Inspector's report, the spiralling cost of the taxpayer and the increasing pressure on and violence towards police officers and indeed others, it's imperative that the government acts. Now, turning to the impact that these measures will have on protests. It is not the case that they will unnecessarily restrict civil liberties. The impact these measures will have has been misinterpreted, and the majority of protesters in the UK who behave lawfully will be entirely unaffected by the changes. This misinterpretation and hyperbole has been repeated across all the public order measures in the bill and is unjustified. It is not the case that these measures allow the police to ban protests. It is not the case that these measures will criminalise protesters who are annoying. Public nuisance is already an existing offence, and we are simply stating it in statute to provide certainty for everybody. It is not the case that these measures will ban protests outside of Parliament. You will remember, Mr Gray, because you were here at the time, that it was a Labour government in 2005 who banned protests outside Parliament, resulting in one famous occasion of the arrest of an individual woman reading the names of the war dead from Iraq outside the cenotaph. The clause in our bill merely relates to the passage of vehicles into and out of the parliamentary estate, allowing elected representatives to exercise their democratic rights and conduct our democracy in the way people would expect. It is also not the case that these measures will ban noisy protests. The police will only be able to impose conditions on unjustifiably noisy protests that cause harm to others or prevent an organisation from operating. For example, if a business has to shut down because of the noise that is being created. We did, in fact, put forward several legislative measures to Her Majesty's Inspectorate for their consideration, and this included, for example, a measure to enable the police to stop and search protesters. They concluded, and I quote, "With some qualifications, all 5 proposals would improve police effectiveness without eroding the right to protest." The Inspectorate goes on to recommend that the government consider further measures to require organisers of public assemblies to notify the police of their intention to do so, and to enable the police, in exceptional circumstances, to apply for the prohibition of public assemblies. However, following careful consideration of the impact these measures will have on the police's ability to manage protests as well as civil liberties, we are not proceeding with the full range of measures which the Inspectorate has supported, striking a balance, we think, therefore, between the legitimate and fundamental right to protest and the rights of others to go about their business unmolested. In short, these measures have been portrayed by some to be draconian and a dismantling of our civil liberties. This is misinformed at best and misleading at worst. These measures simply seek to improve the balance of the rights of protesters with the rights of others, as I say, to go about their business unhindered, and will allow the police to take a more proactive approach in managing these disproportionately disruptive protests. It will not grant them sweeping powers to override their obligations. When using these measures or existing public order powers, the police must be able to demonstrate that their use is necessary and proportionate. They will also need to be able to show due regard to human rights obligations. This highlights our continued commitment to the absolutely fundamental right of peaceful protest, balanced, as I say, against the rights of others to go about their business. And I commend the government's response to the e-petition.
Matt Vickers, to wind up.
Once again, I'd like to thank all the petitioners who provided us with this opportunity to debate this very important topic. And I'd like to thank all the members who participated for a robust debate. I'd also like to thank the Minister for his response and the government's commitment to protect the right to protest. Given the public interest in this topic and the passion with which everyone has made their argument, it's clear that this is something that we all care deeply about. Whilst we have our disagreements on the issue, I look forward to us being able to have our say on this vital piece of legislation as it continues its progress through Parliament. I hope that we can get the balance right for those who want to get to work, ambulances that want to get to hospital, those who want to print or read a newspaper or use public transport, and moreover, those who want to protest safely without their cause being hijacked by those who seek to cause disruption or harm. Thank you.
The question is, this House... I'll take my mask off, I think. The question is, this House has considered e-petition 579012 relating to right to protest. The minister can say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.